Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of our Seven Investing podcast. I'm Seven Investing founder and CEO Simon Erickson, and we've heard a lot of headlines in technology in recent years, whether it be cloud computing or artificial intelligence or machine learning or whatever else it might be. There's a lot of buzzwords that are floating around out there. And today I'm very excited to welcome a technical expert to help us drill down into a lot of those trends that are developing. My guest is Ben Book. He's the co-founder and CEO of GigaOm out in California. Ben, thanks very much for joining Seven Investing for our podcast here this afternoon.
Of course, Simon. Thanks for having me.
Ben, let's start at the 10,000 foot level. We hear a lot about the digital transformation. I know that at GigaOm, you are not only advising executives about innovative technologies that are out there, but also helping them implement it into their own organizations as well. What are your overall thoughts about this phrase digital transformation? What does it really mean to you?
Yeah, digital transformation has been a big buzzword, to your point, that's been around for quite a while. I think most enterprises have come up with different definitions of what that really means to their business, but at the core of what it means to modernize their business, to build new digital products and services that support their revenue and their customers. And enterprises have tried to do this over the past number of years. Some of them have succeeded, some of them have failed. But at the root of it, the purpose of doing digital transformation is really around boards and CEOs wanting to be software companies and wanting to be valued as software companies. If you look at companies like Snowflake, like Zoom, these unicorns that are coming out of Silicon Valley, they're trading at really high multiples, and even the tech companies are trading at high multiples. So boards and CEOs want to have parts of their business have higher multiples, and also have their core business start to trend to be a digital business. So it's always been a challenge for a company who's a legacy company to figure out how do you work in the new economy, the digital economy. And some companies like Disney have done a good job preparing for that, like their streaming service. Other companies have prepared for that, like Henkel, for example. They've modernized their data infrastructure. A lot of them did it prior COVID, and those ones picked a good time to be successful. A lot of other ones are still trying to figure out what that means to them. And I think at the core of it, again, it's just digital services and modernization, and it's challenging for companies who don't grow up in that culture, right? I mean, if you grew up in Silicon Valley, it's a different culture than growing up in the finance ecosystem and industry in New York versus Texas with oil and gas. So it means something different to every industry and every enterprise, but at the core of it, it's really about valuation and driving growth for these companies. And so, boards and CEOs want their IT teams, want their product teams, want their marketers, want their HR people thinking about how can you apply technology to your business so that we can, one, either be valued as a software company and get a really good valuation, or use technology for things like automation to be able to drive, cutting costs and things like that. So again, it's a big buzzword, to your point. It means something different to everybody, and lots of companies have succeeded and a lot of them have failed.
Sure. And if we're in a 9-inning ball game in American enterprises doing the digital transformation, where the 9th inning, everybody's converted everything over the cloud, everything's gone digital exactly how they wanted it to. And one is they're just getting started. Where are we? Are we in the 3rd inning? Are we in the 6th inning? Where do you think we are in America?
That is a good question. That's a good question. So I think most enterprises are in the 2nd or 3rd inning. And the starter's thrown about 70 pitches or so, and they're hitting the second round or 3rd round of batters, and they're trying to change it up. They're trying to switch it up. They're trying to change the pitch that they're throwing, and they're still experimenting, right? I think that's a big thing, that they're experimenting and they're still trying to figure out as new technology comes out, like blockchain, like security, like it is a constant evaluation, a constant evolution, and we'll never, I think, get to the 9th inning, to be honest, because it's a constant evolution. So the companies who are, 3rd or 4th inning, I think they're moving along. There's some who are like the 6th inning and 7th inning, and they'll always be there. But it'll be pretty impossible for everyone to always be on trend, because these, if you're looking at a large enterprise, there's just so many moving pieces, and then you have the political and government, compliance issues that they have to go through, which slow them down too. So there's more than just technology that enterprises have to fare with.
Fair enough. Okay, 2nd or 3rd inning in the digital transformation. Sounds like a great time to go get a hot dog and a $15 beer from the ballpark. Let's shift gears a little bit here, Ben. You had mentioned Zoom and Snowflake just now, 2 companies that have been rewarded by very high valuations by the market. They're also very focused on the cloud, and we've seen a lot of software as a service companies, infrastructure as a service companies, platform as a service. Everybody seems to be moving workloads and data over to Amazon. Of course, Snowflake is allowing for multi-cloud strategies for companies that are embracing that. But we're also hearing about other kind of shoots from this as well, right? Edge computing is kind of a big deal, where a lot of people are trying to say, hey, don't send everything out to the centralized cloud. You can do this closer to where your users are. Where do you think we stand with cloud computing right now? Have we gone through phase 1.0 of the cloud and we're starting to see some new interesting things come out of this?
Yeah, I think, in terms of cloud, there's been a big shift for enterprises to want to leverage the cloud, specifically with, issues like COVID, where companies need to be more agile. But essentially, enterprises just want to get out of the business of running IT, right? So they want to be able to move something from on-premise in their own data center, get out of the data center business, and really allow their people to, do what people do best, which is innovate and, build new services instead of managing a service. So that's the big thing that, most companies want to do when they move to the cloud. And then they want to think, okay, now we're in the cloud, how do we access higher level services like chatbots, like DevOps, like container services to make things more efficient? So a lot of companies have tried to do this lift and shift thing. The problem with that is that most enterprises aren't familiar with cloud, and they don't understand that it actually is more complex to have a cloud environment sometimes than having something on premise. And then two, they typically don't have the talent to manage a lot of that when it moves to the cloud. And there's an idea that it's easier to manage things when it moves to the cloud. It's actually harder in many cases. So now everyone's just like you said, the third inning, fourth inning, seventh inning, ninth inning, where are we with cloud? We're kind of in the third or fourth inning too. Companies have moved to the cloud, they've had a good experience, or they've had a bad experience and moved back on-prem, or they moved to the cloud. Now they said, okay, let's look at edge and let's think about some of the use cases we want to do around edge. And then just back to the point about Snowflake and Zoom, it's so much easier to innovate, and it's so much easier to start a company using cloud, right? You don't have to have a data center to build a digital service. And that's a huge opportunity for most companies. And that's why we're seeing an explosion of startups, because you can just spin something up in Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and you can be off and running, and you can build an MVP and then go raise a bunch of money and then, be a real player. We worked with Snowflake back in 2015 when they came out of stealth. And we worked with them really closely for about 2 or 3 years before any of the other research companies caught up with them. And, they just, pretty much took the entire market by storm, because they had the best easy to use technology and everybody wanted to use it. And nobody was close to them because the legacy companies were 2 or 3 years behind them. And it took them 2 or 3 years to catch up. And now I think it's getting interesting for Snowflake, because now they have to compete with the legacy providers. But it just shows that a company can come out of nowhere and build a multi-billion-dollar company with hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. You could not do that before cloud. You'd have to build a data center, you have to get a network, you'd have to build the security. And so cloud has really leveled the playing field for innovators and people that want to start new companies. And then for enterprises too, it allows them to be more agile, allows them to be more flexible, allows them to try new things and know that not everything is going to succeed and not have to put a huge investment into it. So it's really just essentially created that ability to be agile, ability to free up your people from managing a storage instance, to using that resource to help you build the next generation product. And that's really what most CIOs, what most CEOs want their IT team to do. Don't be the janitor of your data center anymore. Use technology for business advantage. So again, we can get that software valuation, right?
Yes, very true. Do you see that there's a preference for any of the cloud service providers and the ecosystems that they have? I mean, Amazon was obviously one of the first to really develop this space, but are customers or large enterprises preferring one of those over the others?
Yeah, I think most enterprises have a large service provider that they work with, and that is typically an Oracle, a Microsoft, an IBM, and Amazon, and that depends on the legacy that they have with those companies. So, you have the traditional Oracles, IBMs, the Microsofts, they have a customer base that will likely stick with them through this transition. And then you have the new players like Amazon and Google that are coming in, who are, attacking the market to look for new customers. Amazon's done an amazing job building new services and kind of going after a market that was untapped before. So just like we just talked about Snowflake, Amazon essentially said, hey, we're going to go after the non-huge enterprises, because there's actually more of those in the world than there are large enterprises. And, they did a really good job with that. They also, of course, were able to get a lot of the startups to use them. So, and now they're trying to get back into the enterprise game. So they're trying to go backwards to the legacy companies who are using Oracle, IBM, and Microsoft. And Google is looking for new customers, new workloads, I think they're not as enterprise ready as Amazon and Microsoft, and they're still like very focused on a couple of specific niches that they want to win, like AI, for example. They do a lot of investment there, or Kubernetes, for example. And Microsoft is the only company who bridges those gaps. Microsoft has a huge ecosystem. They have a huge partner ecosystem that helps sell them. They work with large enterprises, they work with mid-markets, and they're also capturing new workloads. So you have kind of the Amazon and the Googles who are still trying to get back into that enterprise world. You have the legacy companies trying to fight off Amazon and Google and Microsoft, and you kind of have Microsoft sitting in the middle who can play both of those because they have a legacy customer base and they're still innovating. Not always at the pace that Amazon is. I think Amazon certainly is innovating faster than Microsoft in many cases, but Microsoft's right behind, and that's always been their strategy, and that's allowed them to always be a really successful company in all these spaces.
Yeah, so those existing relationships that they have are in fact sticky with the enterprise, but there's also some advantages to being cloud native, like you mentioned earlier.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, so I think the Amazon is still going to be number one, Microsoft number two, Google number three. Oracle and IBM will just stick around with their customers. They're just not spending the amount that they need to spend. They're not innovating, and to be honest, they just don't have the culture that a lot of these other cloud companies have in terms of the speed that they move. If you look at the way that Amazon and Microsoft, Google, they innovate and they constantly are delivering new services, and the way that their teams move, they just move at a much faster pace than IBM and Oracle, because that's also what their customers are asking for. So it's really a customer need, and as well as staying on top of the market.
Ben, another topic that's gotten a lot of attention in recent years is artificial intelligence, which we're kind of progressing from that being the buzzword to machine learning being the buzzword, which is a little bit deeper into the trenches.
Yep.
But as we've seen, you can do some really neat things with this. Train your data centers to label data. We've seen GPUs explode in popularity for parallel computing. We've seen it in self-driving cars, image recognition, video rendering, things like this. But in terms of the enterprise, it seems like maybe artificial intelligence is still early in the innings of this ball game. What are you seeing enterprises really having an interest in artificial intelligence to accomplish for them?
Yeah, what we see with most enterprises is they do a bunch of science projects across different applications. Typically, it's an application that's core to their business. So, for example, we worked with TransLink, which is a transit authority in Vancouver. They picked an application that allows people to track, when the bus is going to come. And so, that's one example. Johnson & Johnson uses it for their HVAC data. We just did a case study on a hospital ORs and how they're using computer vision to be able to track surgeries. So, picking an application and then trying to figure out how you can essentially apply automation to that problem. AI right now, in the way machine learning is set up, is really just to take in a lot of data, make decisions on that data, and then output some data. It's still not this general AI thing that a lot of people talk about. And so most enterprises are going to do a couple science projects. They get a couple wins under their belt, and then again they'll productionalize it, and then they'll go to the next application, and they'll go to the next application. And I think the interesting thing about AI and ML is that most enterprises know that it's going to make an impact for their business. There are verticals that have been doing this for a long time, like finance, right? Finance has been doing this. Insurance has been doing this. I think some of the newer entry levels for AI and ML across industries are things like healthcare and the traditional, we'll call them slower moving industries because of governmental regulation or other larger issues. Retail is now trying to move to e-commerce. There's a lot of AI and ML in the way that you personalize things. So there's going to be a huge mainstream adoption of AI. I think it started about a year ago, and we're going to continue to see that. We did an AI event about 5 years ago, and it was still very nascent. People were still trying to figure out what it meant. Now everyone's done a couple projects, and they kind of have a feel for what it's going to do. And then the question is, how do you operationalize it? Using data tools and data scientists. But again, people want to, have the infrastructure and have the technology do the automation around it, so you don't have to have the data scientists to do it. There's not enough data scientists in the world. There's not enough cloud engineers in the world. There's not enough data engineers. So these cloud companies, these software companies, are providing that kind of layer to manage the messiness of all of these different applications. once you stand it up. So, if you look at the web scale companies like Netflix and Twitter, they just use open source stuff, and no enterprise could have a team of 200 open source engineers to build something for their, application for retail. Financial services companies would invest in that stuff because they have the people and the resources. So now we're kind of hitting the mainstream that can purchase technology in a box, as we like to call it. The mainstream likes to purchase things in a box. They don't want to like tweak with it and hire a bunch of really high profile engineers to build it out. So I think that's one thing we're seeing kind of at the implementation layer, but also higher level up for the enterprises who are seeing business value. And some business values like 4%, 5% ROI. Sometimes you can see a really dramatic ROI, 25, 30% for ML and AI. And that's really when CEOs get excited about that stuff.
And it sounds like a lot of those enterprises are learning more about how they can use AI, right? It was for standard functions, like you mentioned, finance, things like that. But now they're realizing, hey, we've got some unique data. Maybe these science projects should actually be implemented on a commercial scale.
Correct. Yep, exactly.
Yeah, very interesting. Is there any other bottlenecks? I mean, you said there was kind of a shortage of data scientists and a shortage of people that can do this work, and probably just an overall education of what AI can do. Is there any other bottlenecks holding this up on how the enterprise is deploying AI today?
Yeah, a big one is data. A lot of enterprises have lots of data, and it's everywhere, and it's messy. Sometimes they don't know where the data is. So just wrangling the data has been the first step. So essentially, while everyone's been working on their little science projects for AI, they've also been trying to get their data in order and figure out how they can get their data in order so that they can take advantage of AI. Again, enterprises are still in the second or third inning of that. They might be in the fifth or sixth inning of building AI workloads and really doing their science project, but to be able to productionalize it and do it at scale, you have to have the data infrastructure, which is why these companies like Snowflake and other companies in the data space are really growing really rapidly, because customers need to put the data in somewhere that they can access it, right? And so, and in a lot of cases, you want it to be in a structured format. So you want to put it in a database, you want to put it in a data warehouse, and you need to have it in a place that is accessible and usable. You also have data lake companies and data lake like Cloudera, like Teradata, Microsoft, all of these companies. And specifically in healthcare, you're seeing a lot of this. A lot of the data is trapped in PDFs. It's trapped in a doctor's note, right? I mean, that's a great example. It's not always just trapped in a database somewhere underneath someone's desk. It's actually trapped in like something that's unstructured. So the big initiative now is, how do we get the data out of a PDF? How do we get it out of an EMR? Once we can get it out of there, then we can do something with it. But because a lot of these industries are still very paper-based, even finance, it's really hard to productionalize that data. So that's what I'm excited about. Healthcare, for example, healthcare for a long time has been very siloed, and it's really hard to get all of the different players, the pharmaceutical companies, the providers, the insurance companies, all to work together. But now we're starting to see that these companies are starting to digitalize their assets. Pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies have been a little bit better than healthcare systems because their business is built on the data. But once healthcare systems can really start to bring that data to life, that's where it's going to get exciting. And I think a lot of enterprises are there. And then even below enterprises, a lot of mid-market companies want to do this, and they weren't able to do it before because they weren't able to access this type of technology. Now they're able to access it because of cloud services. So, it's a great another example, like, small, medium businesses, startup can access cloud services. Mid-market companies can buy this thing out of the box. They don't have to have a bunch of open source engineers or data scientists to manage it. They can play with it, and it's low code, no code. You probably heard that buzzword too.
Oh, yeah.
Using things, essentially allowing anybody who can click a button and knows what their business needs can now use technology. And that wasn't the case 5 or 6 years ago. And that's why, we're seeing a huge adoption, not just in the enterprise, but now mid-market and SMB, to really be able to use technology. And, companies like Twilio, right? They went after the mid-market, just like Amazon did. They're $1 billion company. The mid-market is a huge, huge market. Enterprise is great, and everyone is used to, these IT companies selling into enterprise, but the mid-market is pretty big, and it's a little bit bigger than enterprise if you look at the whole market. So that's what's interesting to see, is how not just the enterprise leverages technology, but the mid-market, because now it's accessible via the cloud.
Yeah. So it's not just a science project anymore with the largest companies that can afford teams of data scientists. It's actually useful for a smaller company to be able to harness AI now.
Yeah, yeah. A company who's 10 people, 20 people, 30 people, if as long as you have the data, you can plug your data in and the AI will take care of it, because of all the work that Microsoft and Amazon and Google has done to find that data and train against their own models. So that's where you get to leverage these super huge hyperscalers at scale. IBM and Oracle and those other companies, still haven't been able to get to that scale because they're still focused on, the enterprise and the specific enterprise help and selling consulting service to them. They haven't gotten to the scale that Microsoft and Amazon and Google have, and that's what's going to allow them to succeed in, again, not just the enterprise but the mid-market.
Yeah, that's great points, Ben. One perspective I'll add to that too, that I think is also a bottleneck for a lot of this right now, is there's this huge supply shortage right now of chips, of high performance chips that are needed for these AI workloads, right? It's not so simple that you can just go ahead and run this on any kind of processor you want. And we've kind of seen this transition for several years now, CPUs to GPUs, because they could run things in parallel, which is much more efficient. For AI accelerators, for doing these workflows were really difficult. But now we're starting to see even some more exotic chips, right? Like ASICs. We're starting to see FPGAs, stuff like this that wasn't getting a whole lot of attention. It was just more for people that were tinkering, that want to do all this engineering and play with these things. Now they're actually deploying them at scale. And it's really interesting to see the shortage of the foundries, the global foundries and the Taiwan semiconductors and these kind of players of the world, how backed up they are from demand of companies that are saying, hey, we want to use AI. This requires a boatload of processing to do it. And we need to get a little bit smarter than just the typical processors we've used.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, we've been covering AI in data centers for about 12 years now. And, the challenge with data centers and the chip companies is it requires a lot of investment, right? Just like with the Googles, the Microsofts, Amazons we just talked about, you got to build data centers, multi-billion-dollar investments. And, there's only a small number of companies who can, make that type of investment, like an Intel, for example. And then you have, companies like NVIDIA who are building the playbook or the blueprint for the chip, but they don't manufacture it. And then that's up to the manufacturer or the engineer to do it. And then you have the companies like ARM, who's very similar to NVIDIA, where they, essentially give you the blueprint. So, I think that the interesting thing in our industry is, what are companies doing with chips? Yeah, they're buying GPUs and they're trying to get more access to those things for AI. But I think the really interesting thing is, how we're applying chips and semiconductors to IoT. IoT is something that we've talked about for a long time. And just like with cloud, I think we kind of hit that mainstream about a year or two ago. And also with AI, everyone wants to apply a chip to something, right? A chip to your car, a chip to your coffee mug. I have this coffee mug here. Now I think I'm now a believer in IoT because I spent $150 on this coffee mug that keeps my coffee hot for 8 hours.
Love it. I want one.
So I can control it with my phone. I can control the temperature. I think everyone really wants to have that kind of digital experience with everything, right? And that goes back to the digital transformation conversation we were having too. So I think the things that will be prioritized by a lot of these chip companies and getting through the supply chain challenge will be the GPUs and all of these things. For the traditional things, I think the big need is, hey, for IoT we need like a trillion semiconductors. Like there's no way that no matter what investment you make, we're going to build enough capacity. So it might slow down the IoT ecosystem a little bit. But I think we'll get through it. It's just going to take a little investment. It's going to take 3 or 5 years to get through it. It's always takes longer than we expect. And then the companies who are the largest, like the Intels and Apples, they'll help us get through it. And then the long tail will be the smaller companies who then are leveraging those ecosystems. So it's definitely going to be some very short-term pain for companies like automobile companies who don't have that infrastructure, who don't have the partners to build that, because they haven't built a partner ecosystem and they don't have the manufacturing capacity either. So yeah, it'll certainly be interesting, but I think IoT will probably take the biggest hit.
Great point. Speaking of things that tend to take a little longer than you expect to get up and running, let's double click on healthcare. You mentioned that so much of this is in doctor records and PDFs, and it's been slow to adopt technology. We tried a couple of years ago to do a nudge with electronic health records and different regulations that tried to push a lot of this paper patient records to digital ways of doing this. And then we've seen kind of Google and now Apple really trying to figure out healthcare because it's a $4 trillion market in America. What's your thoughts on the biggest opportunities for healthcare that are actually implementable? And how does the relationship between hospitals and patient privacy and all of the other complexities of healthcare factor into this?
Yeah, so I started my career in healthcare consulting, working with hospital systems and working with insurance companies. So I got firsthand experience about why those two parties don't like working together and really the financial implications of that. Really with healthcare, it's hard because you have all of these different parties and they're all not working under the same incentive plans, to your point. So you have healthcare systems who, want to control the data, they want to provide better outcomes, but at the same time, they want to control everything. And then you have the doctors working in the facilities who, again, don't work for the facility. Then you have the insurance company, the pharmaceutical company. So, the biggest challenge with this is, how do you get everyone to share data so that you can take better action on the data, you can have better patient outcomes. So I think we've seen, to your point, with some of the hospital initiatives over like the last 5 to 10 years, pushing this ecosystem to consolidate a little bit so that you can get more sharing of information. That didn't actually happen. All you did was get consolidation, and then these companies just got bigger, and it got harder for individual practices to operate because then they didn't have as much leverage with the big insurance companies, et cetera. But now we have more centralization with these different parties. So the question is, how do we still incentivize these parties to work together? At the end of the day, like hospitals want to decrease costs, insurance companies want to decrease costs. They're on the same initiative there. So I think if we can get these two parties to be incentivized, again, this is very difficult and it'll probably still take a long time. But if you can get those two parties to work together to share the data that, again, is locked in all of these different systems, then you can start to get it to feed into the IoT devices, right? You can get it to feed into the devices that the patient needs. You can get it to track what's happening in the OR and give the insurance companies access to that information so that they can help the hospital system make better decisions in terms of how they do their care and how they do their claims. So, it's still a very siloed ecosystem, and, the biggest opportunity is data and AI. And right now it's just within those ecosystems. Hospitals are using it for things like surgeries to make sure surgeries go better. They're also using it to manage the data associated with customers or patients. And then healthcare, and then pharmaceutical and insurance companies are doing a really good job using AI so that they could process claims faster and things like that. But I don't see a huge impact on the sharing of data still yet. I think we still have a far way to go on that.
It's still siloed. That's what you're saying, Ben. You're using it for certain applications, but it's not really sharing all healthcare data everywhere.
Correct. Yep. So you can have an individual patient outcome and you can have a great outcome, but there's nothing that the insurance company is able to leverage from that and learn from that. And I think a lot of what in the technology ecosystem here in California, in Silicon Valley, it's all about learning and it's all about trying new things. And it's hard to innovate when you're not sharing and you're not collaborating. So I think, we'll see new models come up, like a hospital system having its own insurance company. That's interesting because then they can share the data and they can actually be more effective and efficient. So I think, we certainly have a long way to go, but I'm excited about the opportunity with IoT devices in healthcare. I'm excited about using AI on automation and surgeries for better patient outcomes. So there's always like little use cases everywhere, but nothing huge and really mega trend for the industry currently.
Yeah, and speaking about San Francisco, do you think that Google or Apple is making more progress in healthcare today?
So, I think Apple has a leg up because of the way that they use data and the way that they consume data and the way that they access with consumers. Google, of course, has Android and they have a lot of devices and platforms in the field. But the way that, Google does things, I don't see them making a long-term bet on healthcare and really enabling it. They have a cloud, which is great. They have, an initiative to go after healthcare. But I think it's really going to come back to the patient and what the patient wants to give up. And I think Apple has a leg up with them on that. So we'll see how that progresses. I know Google's tried a lot of things over the years, So, I think Apple will probably do a little bit better in that game in the short term. I think if Google keeps investing, and again, it's about an ecosystem and a partnership. So if Google can build partnerships with the healthcare systems, with the providers, the problem is I don't think a lot of customers trust Google. So, and patients trust Google, and the consumer trust Google. So, I think they've kind of fallen into the same issue that Facebook has come up with trust, and I think Apple has that trust. So if Apple can exploit the trust and work with customers to get the data that they need, then they can provide additional services on top of it. So they each have their own opportunities, but each have their own challenges for sure.
I certainly agree, Ben. And you saw that a couple of years ago when Google was kind of beta testing this with Nightingale. They got embedded with some patient data, and there was just kind of this backlash of we don't want Google to have access to all of this. And Apple certainly seems to be controlling the narrative of privacy paramount. And I think that as we're kind of shifting to devices and consumer-facing healthcare, they certainly seem to be in the driver's seat for that one.
Yeah. Google should buy a company, invest in a company that's not called Google to do healthcare. And then I think exactly. they might get a couple of things from that.
Yeah, fair enough. Ben, last question for you. Our audience at Seven Investing is mostly individual investors that really want to get a firsthand view of the trends that you look at every day. You're deploying a lot of these technologies. We hit on several of them today, but there's a lot we haven't talked about yet, whether it's quantum computing or blockchains or any of the other cool stuff that's out there. Is there anything else that you're looking at right now that you think is particularly attractive? And bonus gold star points if it's not something that's already in the headlines that everyone else is talking about.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, quantum computing is certainly interesting. It's a long way away from we're like in the second pitch of the first inning or something like that. Right back to your analogy. It's certainly interesting, but we're a long ways off from that. I think things like just everything in security right now is just exploding. The reason why it's exploding is because for a long time, enterprises, mid-market SMB, again, haven't been able to access the things that they need, or they didn't want to spend the money on it. And now they have to spend the money on it because everyone is getting breached, everyone's getting malware, everyone is getting hit from every direction because, again, they're building these digital services. So everything in security is super hot. And when you work with an enterprise, they don't always need a really good reason to buy security. It's just a mandate, or like, we need to have this thing. So everything else in technology, it's what's the ROI, what's the TCO, how's this going to help me get time to value? Security, it's like, yeah, it's binary. And it used to be, well, we don't really need it, it's a zero. Now it's like, we kind of need everything, and let's buy it all. So that's why every technology company, even a lot of the companies like Datadog and these kind of newer companies who are coming from different spaces, is all jumping into the security bandwagon. And there's good reason for that. One, because customers need it, and two, because they can make a lot more money and have a much larger target addressable market. So that's where we're seeing an explosion in the security space. We're investing a lot in security. The challenge is also too, there's not enough talent in security, right? So just like with the data space, the cloud space, there just is not enough talent to be able to support the innovation need that we have there. So we're really excited about security and excited about how enterprises are going to attack it, and again, be more proactive than reactive. I think everyone has been reactive in security for a long time. Again, oh, we don't really need that thing, we'll deal with it if we have a problem. Now everyone knows how many problems they can have and how it's going to really disrupt their business and affect their job to get fired, for example. So everyone is a lot more hypersensitive to it. So they're trying to, in our industry, we say shift left, essentially like put the security in the design versus like, handle the problem, later down the line. So solve the problem so you don't have the problem later, right? So a lot of the companies that we track are, for example, in the DevOps space and the cloud space, are essentially providing that kind of shift left, or that that ability to be more proactive than reactive. In terms of other types of technologies that we're looking at, we covered data, we covered AI, we covered edge, we covered cloud. I think that this idea around low code, no code, or the ability to use applications and build applications without having to be an engineer. Again, there aren't enough engineers in the world. You have services now that can give you access to data and be able to manage data. So, just up leveling the ability to use a technology without having to be a technologist is a huge deal. So anyone who's providing a service like that, and again, Snowflake's a great example. Snowflake built a data warehouse that anyone can use. And that's why they've gotten so much traction early on, because all the other data warehouses were very hard to use and you had to be a DBA or an expert to use. Google, for example, is really good about this. All of their products are so well designed. It's so easy to use. So, that's a huge mega trend that we're going to see in the application space and the SaaS space, moving forward. So I'd say those are two of the things that we're tracking really closely. And then just on the more, blockchain side, blockchain, has been around for a while. Everyone has been looking at different use cases to use. Again, I think we're kind of in the second or third inning of blockchain. People have experimented. They see what it can do. We're writing a report about distributed blockchain with storage. Everyone's trying to figure out how can I use blockchain to intersect with my technology so it becomes the underlying platform, because it is pretty cool. No one just had a really good business reason to use it. It was just a technology thing. So those are some of the things that we're looking at and are pretty excited about.
Yeah, definitely a good list there, Ben. Really an exciting conversation from somebody who's at the front lines of these emerging technologies. Once again, Ben Book is the co-founder and CEO of GigaOm. That is GIGAOM at gigaom.com. You can check out a lot of the great research that they're doing. I checked out your website. I was fascinated by how thorough and how much breadth you have of information. Ben, it was a real pleasure. Thanks for joining me on the podcast here this afternoon.
All right, Simon, thanks for having me.
And once again, thanks for tuning in to this episode of our 7 Investing podcast. We are here to empower you to invest in your future. We are 7 Investing.